right after Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl were revealed, Pokémon surprised us with this. A Pokémon action RPG set in ancient Sinnoh with Cyndaquil as a starter? This is just what my daydreams look like. It almost didn't matter how BDSP looked. That's right folks, I did an 11-hour video. I say prologue. My brain does not work very well. My friends think I'm joking when I say that, but no, I am so serious. Fast forward to February 2022 when it comes out, Pokémon Legends Arceus. For the first time, arguably ever, we have a mainline Pokémon that isn't using the same formula as the rest. Same Pokémon concept, very different execution. You will notice that I said when it comes out, for example, not when they come out. It's Pokémon Legends Arceus, not Pokémon Legends Arceus and Pokémon Legends Bidoof. I'd play that, to be fair. So the game is already really useful. Here you have a series that hasn't budged an inch in 26 years, and all of a sudden you've got this fresh perspective on it. Legends contrasts the rest of the series, all the better to see their respective strengths and weaknesses. Red stands out all the better against green. You're Pokemon fans, you know this. So, we have our video today. We're going to go through the game, yakking about all the stuff that I liked, where I thought it could use some work, and what I hope that means for the rest of the series. Not everything is a home run, of course, but honestly, I kinda love this game. The new setting demands a complete rethink of convention. Your fella has been transported back to the past by Arceus, tasked with collecting all Pokémon. Going in, I thought your guy was just going to be from the ancient past, so initially I kinda balked at this. I like my Pokemon games a wee bit cozier, you know? Most of them start with you living in a sleepy little village. This one starts with divine intervention. But, taking a step back, it makes a lot of sense for the game and its goals. The player is also from modern times, presumably anyway, and also presumably they are familiar with Pokémon. You and your avatar start from the same place. You may have some questions. Who are you? Why has Arceus chosen you specifically? Are you the same protagonist from Brilliant Diamond? The game's answer is that it doesn't matter. You have chosen to embark on this journey by picking up the game, and you can fill in the rest yourself. Somehow, God vanishing you back in time isn't even the weirdest bit of this intro. Apparently, the Pokémon don't shrink because of the Pokéballs, they shrink themselves. That's just something they do naturally. Don't ask me why I'm fine with a fire-breathing dog but not a fire-breathing shrinking dog. I don't have a good answer for you. My instinct, being a giant nerd, is to discredit this change with continuity nitpicks. Why doesn't every Pokémon learn Minimize, then? But if I'm being honest with myself, I think I'm just used to the old version. The healthier question is, why was this change made? Now, I think it's for a couple of reasons, but the main one, for now, is that the setting doesn't really allow for super advanced tech. They need a new excuse for the Pokeballs to work. Now, anything they came up with would have been nonsense because Pokeballs are nonsense anyway, they always have been. The explanation is just a means to an end to get this fantasy to work. There's no point in getting fussy about continuity either, the next game can just as easily change it back. Sure, this is small potatoes by itself, but this attitude carries all the way through. Another shock is the way that Pokémon are treated. The people of Jubilife regard them with fear, suspicion, and even fear. Which is fair enough, honestly. If I saw a mental wee gerbil that could burn my house down, yeah, I'd be worried too. The danger is established very early. Pokémon will now attack you. This is the first Pokémon game where it's possible for the player character to be knocked out. That is what is so useful about a new context. It's been 26 years, we're all used to the idea of Pokémon at this point. But just by putting them in a new setting, just by having some new mechanics, we're forced to look at them with a fresh pair of eyes. A wilderness of territorial, elemental, magical rats is a scary prospect, no matter how cute they are. So Legends Arceus is playing fast and loose with the series conventions. It doesn't throw everything out, mind you. Apricorns are still being used to make Pokeballs, which is a respectful tip of the hat to the series' history. It's just that nothing is sacred. The game is making changes to suit its own ends, rather than worry about tradition. Tradition becomes routine, becomes stagnation, and we all know that Pokémon has been there before. I mean, hell, it practically lives there. It's why, despite my being a massive pedant, despite my nerdy instincts, I kinda have to be fine with them changing how the Pokeballs work. It's a small part of a much larger movement. So, here's the premise. Professor Laventon is part of the Galaxy Expedition team, who are studying the region of Hisui, which you may know better by its modern name, Sinnoh. While many are suspicious, you literally fell out of the sky after all, you're offered a place to stay so long as you can pull your weight. The job market's so bad it takes an act of God to get hired. Still, the ancient past is unforgiving. Fail to make yourself useful and you will be exiled. A Pokémon game actually threatens you with death. Now, I don't think that's impressive because it's dark. I mean, it's Pokémon, behave yourselves. It's just nice that it is taking its own setting seriously, These people don't have the luxury of being as kind as these games usually are. Your trial is to catch Bidoof, Starly, and Shinx. I know. And for that, you will need a partner Pokémon. The starters come from across the series, Rowlet from Generation 7, Cyndaquil from Generation 2, and Oshawott from Generation 5. I don't know what the reasoning was choosing these three in particular, but they are justified subtly by Laventon, who seems to be a bit of a traveller. His speech and his writing imply that he is from Galar, unlike the rest of the Galaxy team. Now, you should already know who I'm choosing. I've always loved Cyndaquil ever since I got Pokémon Crystal for Christmas back in 2001. That was one of the first times that I was allowed to play a game for more than 20 minutes at a time. I could really get my teeth into it, I have weirdly vivid memories of going through Union Cave with Quilava. Now, back in the day, I think it was around Heart Gold and Soul Silver, I couldn't, for the life of me, think of a name for my Typhlosion. I think at one stage I had settled on Kilauea after the Hawaiian volcano, but eventually I decided that I didn't like that either, so I changed it back. But I kinda fat-fingered it, and I ended up spending a week with a Pokémon called Typhlosion. I've had my nickname ever since. Being an action RPG, Legends Arceus controls very differently to your average Pokémon game. The piecemeal tutorial is childproof, with you unable to use moves before they've been explained. But it's spot on, I think. It gives you the information you need, and then it gets out of the way. If you need to review, those pop-ups are in the menu. Bang, sorted. 2 thumbs up. It helps that the game feels a lot more intuitive. The controls are laid out to give you access to all of your moves without going through the menus. Using a Pokeball or sending out a Pokémon is done in exactly the same way. You hold ZR to wind up your arm, you aim, and then you release to throw. All the while you can still move around and switch between your Pokémon and empty balls. It's so fluid, you can send out a Pokémon to smash rocks while barely breaking stride. Do you remember how this looked in Brilliant Diamond? Intolerable. I would also like to praise the aiming. Now, I'm going to go off on a wee tangent here because it's my video, and to hell with you anyway. Switch controllers use what are called gyro controls. They have a gyroscope built in that tells them when the controller is being moved. Now, in theory, I think that gyro controls are a big step forward. The analog stick isn't really that great for aiming, what with its limited range of motion and maximum turn speed. With gyro aim though, you don't just use your thumb, but your entire arm in 3D space, allowing for a lot more speed, precision, and articulation. It makes aiming, a pretty standard part of most games these days, a lot smoother. Again, that's the theory, but the reason that I've never been on board with them in games like, say, Splatoon, is that there's no neutral position. Let's say that you want to aim to the right, so you turn your controller to the right. Absolutely, no problem. But if you want to keep aiming to the right, you need a way to communicate that this is the new neutral. Otherwise, the camera will turn back to the left as your hands reset. So you either need a dedicated recalibrate button, or you need to use the gyroscope in concert with an analog stick. That's awkward because the stick and the gyroscope can pull the camera in 2 different directions. It feels a wee bit like patting your head and rubbing your stomach. I'm sure that I would get used to it if I pushed through, but I don't really want to push through with my limited free time because I'm entitled. And huffy. That's not me projecting, I'm just learning to be comfortable with who I am. Legends Arceus' solution to the problem is to only activate the gyro controls when you're winding up a throw. You have plenty of time to reset your hands between throws, and if the camera does go AWOL, you can just tap B to back out. It's very natural. If you've never been on board, then I would encourage turning gyro on and giving this a go. Even if not, for whatever reason, there's still a great wee lock-on function, so the game's got you covered. There are 2 blots in the copybook though. The first is remembering all the buttons. Now, this is one of those criticisms where I'm just going to have to describe the controls to you. Minus is the map, plus brings out your ride Pokémon when you get it, up on the D-pad is your main menu, down is the Pokédex, while left and right select the ride Pokémon. Like, I kinda get it, they want you to be able to mount up without taking your hand off the analog stick, and like I say, their commitment to letting you do all this without going through menus is brilliant. But I was mixing up the buttons the entire way through. I was opening the decks when I wanted to go for the map, and vice versa. Now, of course, I could waste your time and my time by explaining how I would lay it out instead, but I think I'm just going to say, custom controls, please, and leave it at that. The other issue, and it's an issue that I have a lot, is the limited sprint time. I am flummoxed that modern games insist on doing this. Like, I get it, it's more realistic, it's more immersive, but you have made this massive open space and you keep punishing us for wanting to get around it more quickly. It's just cruel. The Pokédex is a much bigger focus this game. You're part of the Survey Corps, after all. The whole reason that you're here is to conduct an ecological survey of Hisui. The vague sci-fi nonsense of the modern Pokédex is replaced with a much simpler version. It's a book being written page by page by Professor Leventon. This isn't just some new face paint either, it changes the way that the Pokédex works. Instead of scanning a Pokémon as soon as it's caught, or whatever the hell it was the Pokédex did, you have to perform research tasks to fill it in. These tasks range from generic, catch or battle however many Pokémon, to specific, see it use a special move, feed it, startle it. This is a brilliant flourish. The game is laser focused on the Pokémon and their behaviour. You're actually researching how these creatures behave. You're getting more insight by experimenting. While it's enhancing the fantasy though, you are also getting clues about some of the more obscure stuff. One of Piloswine's research tasks, for example, is to see it use Ancient Power, the very move it needs to be able to evolve. So, for the first time, perhaps ever, you can engage with the game without a third-party resource to hand. You're not scampering away to Bulbapedia every few seconds. You are given most, to be fair, of the information you need. It's great stuff. It's one of the big triumphs of this new perspective on Pokémon. Instead of random encounters in grass and caves, the Pokémon are all on the overworld now. Maybe you've noticed. Now, I don't want to take it for granted that this is an objective improvement. I think that the old way still has some benefits. Abstraction can be helpful, letting the imagination fill in the blanks that technology struggles with. We'll get to that later, don't you worry. But if anything, Pokémon often went too far in the other direction. There was too big a gap between the game and the player's imagination. The Pokémon were filed away into menus and rarely interacted with the overworld. It made it difficult to get closure sometimes, to create a singular conceptual space in your head. Or maybe my imagination's just been dampened by years of depression. Who knows? Not a fan of that joke. Either way, the move away from random generation was always kind of inevitable. Processing power has gotten to the point that games don't have to rely on these pen and paper abstractions anymore. And the benefits speak for themselves. Legends Arceus easily creates a coherent world. People and Pokémon are part of the same space, presented visually, but sold mechanically. They will respond to your approach, they'll get suspicious when something is off. You can walk right up to them and they can attack you. You can let your Pokémon out to play whenever you like. They can even interact with trees and rocks. It gives the imagination more to latch onto. You're doing less work to justify this world in your head. That helps to characterise many of the Pokémon. Here's a sizzle reel. Bidoof is oblivious and will come right up to you, while Starly will scatter and Shinx is aggressive. Bibarel has dammed up a waterway, giving you access to the other side of the river. Hippopotas's periscopic eyes sit above the mud. Electabuzz is only found in snowy areas. It evolved into Electivire in response to Hisui's climate. Blissey is skittish, unless you're injured, in which case it'll come right up to check you're okay. Nosepass always faces north, and each Pokémon has its own appropriate habitat. It's not perfect, mind you, there are some compromises. Ghastly and Haunter are just milling about en masse, for example, which makes them feel a bit lifeless. I know they are lifeless, they're ghost Pokémon, but that's my point. They should be jumping out and frightening you. Still, considering how much of an ask this is, I think there's more bangers than clangers. The game even clears up some of the series' long-standing mysteries. Terrestrial Pokémon get little flotation rings on the water, which explains how you're battling at sea. It's a bit goofy, to be fair, but I have to keep reminding myself how goofy Pokeballs are in the first place. What it also means, Pokémon on the overworld, is that there are far fewer interruptions. If you want to catch a Pokémon, you don't have to wade around in the tall grass and then get transferred to a battle screen for a chance at one. You find them by exploring, and then you manually take aim and throw the ball. It's perfectly representational. If a Pokeball misses, you instantly understand why, without needing a dice roll and a text box to explain it to you. That's not to say that luck isn't relevant at all, it's still Pokemon. But the capture check is rapid, a moment's pause, before letting you move on or try again. If you do end up fighting, you go seamlessly into battle and back without disappearing into another dimension. You are still in the same play area, and crucially, you're still using the same controls. When a battle ends, then, you're instantly back to exploring. There's a lot less distance between the two modes of play, and those consistent controls lubricate what little friction there is. This is the final nail in the coffin as far as I'm concerned. I didn't want to take it for granted that having Pokemon on the overworld was better, but at every turn it presents itself as the superior option. It gives us a clearer fantasy, is more involving, it helps characterise the creatures, and it wastes less time to boot. I think it would be a huge waste to go back to the old method. Good as I think it is though, it has to be said that this introduces a different texture to the fantasy. In Diamond, you either stumble into Pokemon or get ambushed by them. In Legends Arceus, the roles are kinda reversed. You're hunting them down. You're the one jumping out of the tall grass. God, I hope I don't use this later to lecture you about the ecology or anything. So, there you have it, the game's basic loop. Your goal is to go out, catch Pokemon, fill in research tasks, and then return to the professor. The better you do, the more you're paid. As you fill in more tasks, your rank increases, stronger Pokemon can be caught, and you earn more money. It's basically the equivalent to the badges in the older games. It is a streamlined, more cyclical experience that makes the exhaustive look format kind of incompatible. I can't really take you through specific beats or areas because more often than not you're revisiting areas and doing the same things. That isn't a bad thing, except maybe for my ad revenue, it's just the way the game is. That said, it's not like there's no story or anything. Rifts in space and time are firing lightning at these culturally significant Pokemon and causing them to go berserk. Sorry, that's a really funny sentence. Oh no, my Whimsicott's been struck by lightning. Oh Christ, how is she? Oh, she went ballistic. The first of these frenzied nobles is Kleavor, who can be found in the Heartwood. And oh, the Heartwood. This is what I mean, man. I used to daydream about this. Kleavor isn't fought in a traditional Pokemon battle. Camming the nobles has you spanning both the action and the RPG. The game starts to resemble a certain other influential action RPG series, what with you avoiding damage by timing rolls and retaliating while the boss recovers, but that's where the similarities end. You have to quell their frenzy by throwing bombs, wee parcels of their favourite food. Now, if I were upset and somebody started launching chicken pakora at my head, I don't think it would improve my mood, but that's not the point. The point is, you're fighting the noble the same way you catch Pokémon, which makes sense. These systems are arguably a bigger part of this game than the battling. Still, it's not like you don't get the chance at all. When Cleavor is stunned, you can buy more time by battling it the old-fashioned way. So the bosses will test you on both of the main mechanics at the same time. Now, I don't think I do great at the test, a B- at best. I'm not happy with how I handled any of them, honestly. I get kind of impatient and focus too much on throwing bombs. My impression is that I did a lot better when I took my time, but I only started figuring that out during the final few fights. If the boss fights look a bit rough, I wouldn't hold that against the game. I'm fairly sure that's on me. Cleavor is actually a split evolution for Scyther, so I thought it would be appropriate for another Scyther to be our second Pokémon. Cleavor seems to be based, at least in part, on the Deadleaf Mantis. So, I named it Litterbug. You know, like plant litter and... I don't answer to you. Instead of linear routes, Legends Arceus kind of goes open world. Now you might go ahead and say that it's not an open world, it's segmented. Sure, yeah, I'm not really interested in splitting hairs. But it's similar, right? A lot of freedom, very few barriers, a lot of ground to cover, objective markers telling you where to go. You can't honestly look at this and tell me it takes nothing from Breath of the Wild. Now, here's the thing, right? I don't tend to enjoy open world games. I prefer having to make choices over being given absolute freedom. There's usually too much space with not enough stuff. Not even the champions of the genre can justify the size of their maps. There's a lot of holding forward between the interesting bits. So, these spaces are often filled in with crafting materials. Gaming's final form, it seems, is running around an empty field picking up sticks. Legends Arceus is guilty of that too, sure. But this series has got a secret sauce, a way to make that space meaningful. It's the entire reason you're playing. Pokémon are everywhere. You've got a reason to interact with every part of the level. Each habitat is a clue as to what might be living there. At the same time though, Pokémon's team building mechanics still let you make what I consider to be real choices. The story missions play out in typical fashion. Waypoint markers will show you the straightest path to your objective, so you don't have to explore this giant world and can just get the game over with. Oh, meow. But in this game you can, and should, and probably need to go off on your own to catch Pokémon. I found myself pissing about a lot, which is absolutely a compliment. I was exploring and catching and battling when I had other things to do, finding my own fun, getting in scrapes, having an adventure. The objective marker is pointing at Solaceon ruins, but I'm currently heading south to catch the next member of my team. The first problem that I had was crossing this river. I'm not sure you're supposed to be able to make this jump yet, but I'm glad that you can. Gume is the Generation 6 pseudo-legendary. It's a snail dragon, with its Hisuian evolutions leaning into that inspiration with a dragon steel typing. Catching one while avoiding the ire of the Alpha Sliggoo in the middle was an interesting little challenge. Do you see what I mean? Like, you know, obviously most open world games will let you go on your own little tangents, but rarely is the outcome as satisfying as getting a new teammate in Legends Arceus. Not only is Slabbers here my own little story now, but it's also a permanent change in how I can play going forward. Let's put it this way, I'm not disappearing into my umpteenth copy-pasted dungeon for a weapon that I can't even use, and Slabbers here isn't going to shatter after half a dozen attacks. Oh, I'm being very catty today. This pseudo-open world is kind of a perfect fit for this series. Which isn't to say that an open world Pokémon would automatically work. I think a big part of this game's success is managing its own size. These are more like open levels, after all, not an open world. It's a sober choice. You would need a lot of space to credibly transition from the seaside to the marshes to the mountains. Segmenting the game like this avoids that problem altogether. Navigation becomes easier. With less stuff to make, each area can be more distinct. The limited play area lets the game curate its landmarks. The Heartwoods, for example, funnel your attention towards the giant tree by both framing it and blocking your view of it from the east. Not only does this draw your interest, you would want to go and investigate this even if the objective marker weren't there. If you can see the tree, you must be standing to the north of it. That would be a lot more difficult to do if the tree had to be viewed from any angle. Altogether, after a wee bit of time to get used to them, I found myself getting around this game's levels fairly comfortably. So, Pokémon might just be the first open world proposition that I truly get. Or, open world adjacent. You get it. Now, of course, I don't mean to say that there have been no other good open world games. But this is the first one that I have really understood. The first one where I'm like, oh, okay, there's a reason for it to be this big. But even then, I still think that the sheer scale and the dedication to emulating a natural world causes a lot of problems as well. Even with the more manageable size, the game still has to be painted in broad strokes. It sacrifices depth for size. Once you get close to any of the landmarks, you will find that none of them live up to the promise. Well framed as it is, there's nothing to do at the giant tree in the Heartwoods. Caves suffer especially. In Diamond, the Solaceon ruins were a little maze that wound themselves down into the earth. In Legends Arceus, the Solaceon ruins look like this. In Diamond, Mount Coronet was this enormous labyrinth that spilled out onto an icy cliff face. Climbing it was a saga. In Legends Arceus, again, Mount Coronet looks like this. Pokémon seems to be uncertain about how to handle this kind of more complex level design with a 3D perspective. None of the original Switch games have attempted anything approaching the complexity of even the simplest maze from the top-down games. A lot more attention would need to be paid to the landscapes for conveyance and orientation. But then, all of them have also had some open-world intentions. The sheer scale of the maps probably puts paid to this level of detail. Exploration suffers as a result, which is a wee bit weird when you think about it, because surely this kind of game is all about exploring. But exploration isn't just about having a lot of space, it's about having interesting things to find in that space. The missions that have you following leads and clues are few and far between. There can't be that many details, and the game can't draw your attention to them naturally. The world is simply too big. So most of the time, objective markers are used instead, the game foolproofing itself by essentially coming with its own guide. Look at this one, for example. We suspect that Drifloon has spirited a child away, but as soon as the cutscene is over, you just psychically know he's behind a shed. It kinda deflates the tension. No pun intended. It's not like Prelude Beach has that many hiding spots. All of this makes the game compulsive and readable. Now that's not a bad thing, there's always a sense of progress which is a good fit for the Switch. But it means that a lot of the game becomes busy work. Your quest log doesn't keep tabs on interesting people and their interesting problems. It's just a list of markers to follow. How do you find out about these markers? Well, because when the people are in trouble, they get big markers over their heads. It's the point, for me, where gameplay becomes content. There's so much of it, and it's all so shallow. It's designed to fill in time rather than create an interesting or memorable experience. It is chewing gum for the mind, it's not fulfilling, and it quickly becomes flavourless. Finally, the naturalistic geometry makes the boundaries of this world fuzzy. Sometimes I will be walking up a slope and then start sliding back down. Now, if I could trust that this was a hard no, that would be fine. I would find another way around. But, like with crossing the river earlier, sometimes it's not a hard no. Sometimes this works. You can get up a lot of slopes if you just rub yourself against them for long enough. It feels gross. I have always hated this ever since I played Oblivion and got my horse to go vertically up a mountain. For some reason, I just keep doing it. Maybe it's a combination of the sunk cost fallacy, the sheer size of the levels, and the objective markers encouraging you to go in a straight line. But then again, maybe I'm just an idiot. How would I know? And, of course, Legends Arceus offers you those genre staples: crafting and gathering. Now, these systems try and create a sense of you being stuck in a survival situation. You have to rely on your wits to fashion the land's meagre offerings into something useful. It makes sense for the game's harsher setting. If you run out of Pokeballs or potions out in the field, you can simply craft new ones, you resourceful little devil, yeah? Except there's no craft about it. You just select the item from the menu and it magically appears, provided that you have enough junk in your pockets. In no way does this feel like you're fashioning something with your own hands. Even beyond the limp fantasy, it just feels poorly implemented. The sheer number of items and materials makes decisions muddy. Many items you can make are niche or essentially useless. Many others are obsoleted by better versions. Do you want to spend 1 apricorn, 1 iron chunk and 1 tumblestone on a great ball? Or do you maybe want to spend 1 apricorn, 2 iron chunks and 2 tumblestones on an ultra ball? You could make more great balls, but you would probably end up using more because they are more likely to fail. So, I don't know what that means. You know? I don't have a strategy or a preference there. It's just kind of exhausting to think about. It's the paradox of choice, isn't it? Like, the more options we have, the less happy we are with our decisions. Comparison becomes harder, and we start to worry about what we missed out on. It's possible that I was just making dogshit choices the entire way through, but I couldn't tell you because I don't feel the difference. Well, not until the end, anyway. Once a meta is established, Sticky Glob then Ultra Ball, thank me later, you're not crafting anything else. All of these different Pokeball types, all of the different foods that attract different kinds of Pokemon, all of this stops existing. Sticky Glob, Ultra Ball, done. Healing items come off a little better because they have different effects. You have to choose whether to use that King's Leaf on a max potion, a max revive, or a max elixir. health, revival, or PP. All of which feels irrelevant because you're never more than a few seconds from a shop and a bed. Now, that's not a complaint about the size of the maps, right? I've already said that I think their sober size is a strength in and of itself. But it's also a good thing because your satchel is absolutely tiny, especially at the start. I'm glad that the levels are small because I was never done running back to camp because my pockets were full of rubbish. It was either that or you start doing the drop it dance where you decide which bit of lint you like the least. I was never taking my materials with me out in the field either because of the lousy size. Like, the whole point of the system, or so I thought, was to improvise out in the field rather than have to return to camp. But because of this system, I was returning to camp 100 times more often. One of the reasons that I was so reluctant to drop stuff was because I never felt like I had enough materials anyway. You throw so many balls in this game that an extra 20 or 30 isn't going to last you very long. And making stronger potions requires you to climb the ladder, using the weaker potions as ingredients. Each potion is exponentially more expensive. Inevitably then, I reckon you just end up buying most of what you need anyway, in which case it's cheaper to buy the materials and then just craft the item yourself. It saves you trawling all over the map, I suppose, but at this point this entire system is just for making items cheaper by having you buy them in 3 or 4 parts. Look, like, if any of this seems weird or contradictory, sure. Like, I want to stress anew the part where I don't know what impact my decisions are having. Like, genuinely, I don't know. Maybe there is an obvious way to play where all of this makes sense, and I've just made an embarrassment out of myself. Like, seriously, if I'm doing it wrong, tell me. At the very least, though, there's one part that makes sense to me. It's really important to me that your Pokémon can interact with the world. To get there, though, they need to have a reason to interact with the world, and that reason is the crafting system. So, you know, I probably don't want to see it binned wholesale. I think that would be a tremendous shame. But still, the main problem is, I'm sick of it. I'm sick of crafting. I'm sick of mashing A to pick up plants, even if you can do it while mounted. Thank you for that. I'm sick of memorising recipes. I'm sick of adding hours of busy work if I run out of materials. And I am sick of these systems being in every single game for the past 10 years. This thin layer of crafting and survival doesn't draw me into the world because I've seen an almost identical iteration of these mechanics a million times before. It's beginning to feel like this is just what games are expected to be like now. Except, like, I don't remember wanting games to be like this. Who's asking for this? I'll bash you. All of this drama before we even get to the technical issues. The levels are trying to create a sense of scale that the hardware just can't handle. If you're watching the footage, you've already seen the problems. A lot of pop-in, low LOD models appear while you're very close, and Pokémon become slideshows with enough distance. I reckon that this is the other reason that shrinking retcon was made. Pokémon do a lot of popping in and out of existence, and this seems like an excuse to sweep that under the rug. Masterful deployment of the Dr. Robotnik's diabolical traps gambit. It looks bad, obviously, but I've got a lot of sympathy for it. Hardware has come so far that people imagine developers can do anything nowadays, when, in a lot of ways, it's harder now than it's ever been. Hardware changes, but people don't. Higher fidelity, bigger maps, better physics. All of this means more work for the developers. Of course, Legends Arceus is on the Switch, which was showing its age even a couple of years ago. But on top of that, no other series has to deal with the shit that Pokémon does. Zelda, for example, aggressively cut its enemy roster when it went open world. Pokémon can't. It has to keep dozens of unique monsters in memory at once. It's no wonder everything looks choppy. I can't imagine that a game that was twice as optimised would handle this gracefully. I'm not saying that absolves it, it still looks rough. I'm just not happy pointing and laughing at it. If anything, I think it's kind of ambitious. Nevertheless, all of these issues might be enough to kill this new Pokémon style stone dead for you, and heck, I wouldn't be able to blame you. I mean, I've listed more cons than pros here. But, personally speaking, I'm still on board because I felt the pros more keenly than the cons. Like I say, this is the first open world derivative that has really landed for me. I would be happy to see more, provided that these problems were getting ironed out. Also, I caught a Murkrow. I named him Moida. Ah, crap, my cousin Donnie got moided outside of 3 Brothers on 2nd. Knucklehead Ambulance goes to 2 Brothers on 3rd. Ah, crap, I fell on my ass. Yeah, alright, that's enough of that. Now, you guys all know me. I'm always giving cringe fail male wife meets power bottom twink daddy, and ideally, I would like to see that reflected in my wee guy. Like with many recent Pokémon games, you can dress up your avatar in a suite of different hats, tops and trews, and shoes and glasses and you get it. I have always been completely on board with this. The avatar is meant to represent you, so the more you see yourself in them, the better. I also enjoy that with 1 or 2 exceptions, all of the clothes are period appropriate. The world doesn't break its own rules for you, you have to inhabit the role. But there's got to be a better way to do these menus. Each colour is listed as its own individual item, which needs a split second to stream in, so scrolling through everything becomes a bit of a chore. It's hard enough as it is to mix and match. You have to buy an item to equip it. If you want to change into something that you've already bought, you need to go right back out and then into a separate change menu. Since your outfit resets when you change category, you can't compare tops to bottoms without buying them first. The hairdresser, on the other hand, is spot on. No notes. Technical issues aside, I'm actually quite taken with the art style. It doesn't go as hard on the sumi-e style as it maybe could. That's traditional Japanese black ink painting, which is meant to capture a sense of spontaneity. But it's quite pleasant to look at. The colours aren't as bold as they were in Sword and Shield, so the game feels more tranquil and relaxed. The clouds have an inky quality. The grass blends into the ground below like a watercolour, and unorthodox choices add to this artistic feel. Leaves are sometimes rendered in blue, and the sky sometimes glows yellow. This painterly style is really easy on the eyes. And that goes double for the character models. The eyes and the mouth are given just enough depth to have impact, but without losing that illustrative 2D quality. They understood exactly what they were trying to abstract and why and how. What's better, none of the Pokémon struggle with that uncanny quality either. I don't quite get the same feeling of their faces being flat textures on featureless blobs. They seem to have the same care given to them. I'm sure the camera distance helps with that, but either way, they look great. Actually, speaking of which, now would probably be a good time to talk about the battles, too. These look much better than Brilliant Diamonds, right? I don't think that's because the animation is that much better. If anything, a lot of them are less complex. It's just that they're better directed. The moves are snappier, so you're making plays more often. You remain in full control of your character and the camera, so the fight always looks dynamic. And the way moves emerge and connect makes sense. Physical attacks will even cross the screen to make contact. That may have looked awkward up close, but you're usually too far away to scrutinise. That's it. That's all it ever needed. Like, look, okay, real talk. I know that we all like to imagine elaborate choreography in our heads while listening to the Pokémon soundtrack. We're all giant dorks here. But unfortunately, the logistics, the reality of animating 250 odd creatures and however many moves, sort of puts paid to that. And I can't ever see that changing. Not while humans are working on the series, anyway. But this looks great, because the game works smarter, not harder. Battles also come with a suite of mechanical changes, which kinda put me in a bit of a weird spot. I don't think that many of them are that successful, and of course I'm going to explain to you why. But overall, I still find myself feeling positively about these changes. The first and biggest change, turn order is now dynamic. Before, both sides would choose moves simultaneously, and the faster Pokémon would go first. Priority moves like Quick Attack would then take priority. Easy. In Legends Arceus, it's a lot more complicated. Basically, each Pokémon has a hidden countdown to their next move. This countdown is influenced by the Pokémon's speed in combination with the move's speed. Quick Attack no longer has priority, it just reduces the countdown so that you move sooner, and Hyper Beam no longer has a recovery turn, it just increases the countdown so that you move later. You can also modify the speed of a move as you select it. Agile style makes it faster but weaker, and strong style does the opposite. It makes it slower but stronger. So essentially the turn order is changing all the time. Pokémon are constantly speeding up or slowing down depending on the move they pick. It's possible for a Pokémon to move twice or even 3 times in a row. This makes the battles far more complicated and unpredictable. But Pokémon is up to its old tricks, explaining absolutely nothing about any of this. The game doesn't tell you how the countdown works, and it doesn't tell you how fast each move is. I didn't realise that buffing moves, for example, actually speed you up. I would maybe have used them more if I'd realised. You know, it's kind of impossible to make strategies when you don't know how the game works in the first place. Moreover, because the Pokémon's speed is constantly changing, the action order at the top right is often wrong. If you assume that the information the game gives you is accurate, you'll sometimes get blindsided. And this is where the agile and strong moves become a bit of a problem. Now, I don't hate them. It is nice to be able to modify your damage while catching Pokémon, even if the bloody thing does still crit. But there's kind of a dominant strategy here. You might even have worked it out already. If Agile Style is going to let you move twice, then you should click that every time. It lets you sneak in an entire extra move. Sure, there's a 20% damage penalty, but that still means that you're doing 180% damage before the opponent can even move. Even the computer understands how absurd this is, and it'll abuse it at every given opportunity. Again, I don't hate it. I don't hate any of this. It's more fluid, it's more organic, and it reduces the emphasis on min-maxing. Before, if your Pokémon had 100 speed and your opponent had 101 speed, they would always move first. This is why EVs and IVs were so important. But in this game, there's a pretty broad range of speeds that will actually give the same results, unless your countdowns happen to end at the same time. But this system is way more complicated, it's way more unpredictable, and it's way more exploitable. Speed was already the most important stat in the game, even before you could move twice in a row. It's not a catastrophe by any stretch of the imagination, it works, it's still a fun game. But there's just way too much to iron out before I would ever consider this over the classic version. Abilities and held items have been completely snipped. Here is some unenthusiastic devil's advocacy. It makes the fights go a lot faster, and it means that you have less to worry about when catching Pokémon. This is the closest that we've gotten to that Generation 1 feeling of just seeing a Pokémon and catching it. Other than that, no, not a fan. It completely flattens a lot of options. Abilities distinguished the Pokémon mechanically and thematically, and held items gave them more strategies. Putting this alongside the action speed, Legends Arceus' battles feel more complicated, but less complex. Still, at least Regigigas might get to be an actual Pokémon now, eh? Okay, so that's us through the negatives now. Let's cheer up a bit. Buffs and debuffs have been changed in a few ways. Firstly, they are no longer separated into physical or special, just offensive and defensive. Secondly, they only last a few turns now, with the moves that buff both stats wearing off faster. Lastly, they no longer stack. Each change either doubles or halves the stat, I think, and if reapplied, they just reset the timer. They are cooking something here. Now, I'm not saying it's done, but I can see the vision. Before, if you could find a couple of turns to Sword Stance, a lot of the time you were just able to snowball off of that. 1v6 was a viable strategy even in the hardest fights. With buffs being limited like this, they demand more thought. You can't guarantee a one-hit kill, you can't just leave a Pokémon in, and you can no longer buff the speed stat, so you still have to work around the action speed. I understand that this would probably kill the strategy dead in like Smogon formats, but this game has no multiplayer. No harm done. Status conditions have also been changed, I think, for the better. Many old conditions, like Flinch, have been folded into the action order. Bite, for example, will increase the opponent's countdown. That's a pretty clever change, even if, again, the game doesn't bloody explain it. Conditions can also be overwritten. If you want to keep the opponent paralysed, you might have to think twice about clicking a move with a burn effect. Status also disappears between battles, so you're not having to lug around a dozen different poultices in your satchel. The big changes, though, are to sleep and freeze. They have been removed entirely, and in their place are Drowsy and Frostbite. Drowsy has a chance for the Pokémon to be too tired to move, all the while they are taking increased damage. As useful as sleep was, it was never that fun to just not be able to move. You're still at a disadvantage while drowsy, but you're still playing the game. Frostbite acts like a special burn. It halves your special attack instead of your attack. It is perhaps the most obvious change that you could think to make, but only because it's so sensible. It even makes some weird kind of sense to me, fire and ice having opposite effects. I don't really have much else to say about these changes, just because I feel so positively about them. Status conditions have needed some housekeeping for years now, and Legends Arceus did a great job of it. I think it is telling that burn and paralysis are completely unchanged. The game knows exactly what it is doing here. If you need to review any of this, the complete status of the battlefield can be found by pressing plus. Fantastic! Last up is a very subtle change, but possibly one of my favourites. Stats are calculated differently in this game, with them starting higher and then growing more slowly. What that means is, in real terms, levels make less of a difference. Even if a Pokémon is 20 or 30 levels behind, it can still dish out some damage, and more importantly, it can take a tap too. It's perfect for a game that is so focused on catching Pokémon. So, some studs, some duds. Despite my problems though, I think that the reason I still feel so positively is because the game is experimenting. It's doing something new. Look, even the most ardent Pokémon defender would have to admit it has been devoted to those mechanics from 1996. Sure, there have been updates, but at a glacial rate. We need this shake-up, we need a new perspective on old ideas. And the only way to do that is to jump in with both feet. You don't learn anything new from your comfort zone, after all. It's why I'm glad this game has no competitive multiplayer. It would almost certainly be unbalanced as is, so to accommodate it, the game would have to start making compromises. A lack of multiplayer lets the game be focused and coherent. If it's unbalanced, that's okay. I'm not saying that I want the series to be committed to this specific iteration. Like I say, some of these mechanics seem a bit lopsided to me. What I am saying is, I would like it to keep trying new things. I can think of at least one change that I would love to see in the main series, and that's what excites me, the opportunity for Pokémon to start taking some real steps forward. If a mechanic is a dud, that's okay. That can be educational, if nothing else. That's the whole value of experimenting, right? You get to figure out what works and what doesn't. The noble Pokémon here is a Growlithe puppy. Through hardship, it overcomes its anxieties and evolves into Arcanine, whereupon it immediately gets struck by lightning. God is cruel. Of course, this maybe isn't the Growlithe and Arcanine that you're used to. Since Sun and Moon, the series has been giving Pokémon regional forms, new designs with remixed stats, typing, and move pools. Some can even get branching evolutions. This is my favourite new thing about the series by a country mile. It makes perfect sense, an extension of the divergent evolution idea introduced by Shellos back in Generation 4. Animals evolve to suit different climates in the real world. Of course Pokémon would have a take on that. It's exciting to see new spins on old ideas, my favourite this time being Hisuian Voltorb, who is part grass, because old Pokeballs were made using apricorns. That's genius. It also breathes some life into some misbegotten Pokémon. I mentioned in the Brilliant Diamond video how a final evolution can be disappointing, because it means that the evolution you may have wanted doesn't exist. Regional forms are a great way to remedy that. I finally have a Typhlosion that I love as much as its first two forms. Of course, it's kinda gone from having a shallow fire move pool to having a shallow fire ghost move pool, which isn't a massive improvement, but, you know, it's okay, I forgive her. I can't be mad at that face. Every Pokémon in this game has a slight size variation, none more extreme than the alpha Pokémon. I never thought a Bibarel would be so intimidating. These things are hench, resistant to stuns, capture, status conditions, and with an inbuilt stat boost. When they spot you, they even shout and knock you on your arse, which honestly does get a wee bit annoying if you're just trying to run past them. The benefit, should you choose to catch them, is that they start with higher stats. Fighting an alpha is always tense, they're the mini-bosses of this game. What better way to show off the size difference than to introduce you to the latest in my long line of NFTs? Nice fucking Torterras. Can you tell that joke was written in 2022? At level 65, this is a wee bit of a challenge, but after a few attempts, we got him. Atlas shrugged. You might notice, seeing Torterra again, how different its moveset is. A lot of moves have been removed or remixed in this game. Earthquake is gone, replaced with Headlong Rush. Think of a ground-type close combat. A lot of the weirder or quirkier moves have been streamlined out, and not every Pokémon benefits. But I've got to be real with you, it's just nice to have a Torterra with a moveset. It even learns Leaf Blade, you know? It even learns Sleep Powder. I'm dying. There's lots to see change in Jubilife, encouraging you to come back and explore a bit between expeditions. While the town itself doesn't physically change, the people do. A lot of them start working with Pokémon themselves. Isn't that ideal? What better way to show growth in a Pokémon game than through the Pokémon? The majority of the requests, side quests basically, start here too. While they're not that exciting mechanically, catch a Pokémon, gather a plant, blah blah blah, the characters, or more specifically the Pokémon, make some of them really fun. This guy wants a Beautifly, so you have to get him a Wurmple. You already see the punchline coming a mile away. Then there is the Missing Eevee quest that genuinely got a reaction out of me. I mean, you don't get points for it, the crying dog gambit, but God help me, it works every time. While in Brilliant Diamond facilities like breeding and the move tutor were scattered all over the map, in Legends Arceus, Jubilife is your one stop for everything you need. It is a wee bit long to get around, especially since you can't use ride Pokémon, but it's not like it's an enormous space and you have these warp points anyway. Warp points that I didn't notice until like 50 odd hours into my playthrough. Leave me alone, man. I had to stop drinking caffeine around this time. I was fucked. With so much to see and do, you kinda have to wonder why you are forced back here every time. There's no way to move between maps directly, so if you want to go between the Cobalt Coastlands and the Crimson Mirelands, let's say, you have to go through double the loading. It's not like Jubilife would be muscled out of the game or anything, you know, it's always going to be relevant. The Coronet Highlands highlights some of the issues with the map screen. With no compass and no more than one waypoint flag, it's easy to get turned around, especially when you're in a new level. If you want to pick up people's satchels, for example, then you have to set each flag one at a time. It makes orienting yourself fiddly because you're in and out of the map so often. More disorienting, the moon rises on the wrong side of the sky. It's at the west when it should be east. It's weird how much this affects navigation at night. Direction feels kinda fuzzy even if you don't consciously notice it. That's really strange. I wonder how that happened. The reason that this is a problem in the Highlands specifically is the level layout. Most of the levels are wide open spaces, but this one has you follow a zigzagging path in the valleys. Adding an objective marker and calling it a day would be kind of frustrating because, unlike the rest of the game, you can't just go as the Murkrow flies. So, instead, the game pulls you by the nose through a linear sequence. This wasn't a mistake. If it didn't do this, then Coronet wouldn't feel like a mountain. But the game needs to be doing all of the work here because navigating is quite fiddly in more complicated terrain. Still though, I think that this small problem is worth it because it helps to distinguish this level. Even with this scale, Legends Arceus does a great job of this. Grass, woods and flat terrain in the grasslands, bogs and swamps in the Mirelands, cliffs and water in the coastlands, and a steep upward climb in the Highlands. Of course, this small issue isn't even an issue for long because Sneasler lets us climb walls. I like it so much that I'm going to go and get another one. The evolved form of Hisuian Sneasler, has this absolutely absurd move called Dire Claw. 60 power, 100 accuracy, and a 50% chance of inflicting either poison, paralysis, or drowsy. That is insane. So I've named her Unless, because of the conditional clause. Now, Sinnoh has always been about history and spirituality. There was no better region to explore the Pokémon world's past, in my opinion. Each of the collectible plates and poems tells a little story on its own, a whisper from the ancient past. The mural in the Solaceon ruins is reframed to become part of a character arc. All lives touch other lives to create something anew and alive. It's a simple trick, but it landed for me, maybe because I've known about those words for ages. The climax of the game takes place at the temple that will become Spear Pillar, which kinda leaves me a little bit disappointed. One of the most tantalising parts of that reveal trailer was the suggestion that we were going to get answers to some of the big mysteries. Who built the Solaceon ruins? Why? Who built the temple at the peak? Are we going to find out more details about Regigigas? No, as it turns out, because even a few centuries ago these ruins are already ancient history. Another example is Gyarados. In the present day, legends tell of it raising cities. In the ancient past, legends told of it raising villages. Even though we're hundreds of years in the past, we don't get a new perspective. What did people think of it before this incident? You know, I would have loved to have seen that. It's kind of the same problem that Zelda has, right? Like, every game needs ancient temples and legends and prophecies, so every time they do a prequel, you find out that there are even ancienter temples and legends and prophecies. The time frame changes, but the context stays exactly the same. Still, the attitude is quite different. The Galaxy Expedition team distrusts Pokémon, with Commander Kamado's hometown having been levelled by a rampaging monster. Maybe it was that Gyarados. The indigenous Diamond and Pearl clans are set in their ways, questioning why you need to catch these Pokémon in tiny little balls in the first place. Your survey seems pretty humane, all things considered. You're even rewarded big time for releasing Pokémon back into the wild. But still, it's not like they don't have a point. It's a weird feeling stealing a Pokémon away from its alpha, or taking advantage of a Bidoof's trust when it runs up to say hi. Your invasive behaviour is a lot more obvious with such an untarnished world. We have seen how this world turns out. Combi are all over the place in this game, while they're extremely rare in Diamond and Pearl. It makes it a lot more difficult to swallow the game's platitudes. The Diamond and Pearl clans are fashioned after the indigenous people of Hokkaido, the Ainu. Hokkaido was annexed by mainland Japan in the mid-1800s during a time called the Meiji Restoration. They were forbidden from practicing their religion or even their agriculture, and their land was divided amongst the mainland Yamato. By the end of the 19th century, the Ainu people had been formally erased. Officially, there are 20,000 Ainu living today, but unofficially there are estimated to be 10 times that many who either aren't aware or won't admit it because of the social stigma. There's no time frame given for Legends Arceus, but there are plenty of clues about what it's referencing. The Meiji Restoration saw Japan open its borders after years of isolationism. Japan started to use Western industrial techniques around this time. In Legends Arceus, the Galaxy Hall's smokestacks are made to resemble Galarian wheezing. Sword and Shield had a quiet queasiness about the Industrial Revolution that Legends Arceus adopts. You also have to remember where Leventon's from. It's obvious what it's referencing. The Galaxy Expedition Team seems to be the Pokémon equivalent of the Hokkaido Development Commission. What was in the real world a genocidal campaign is presented in Legends Arceus as a respectful exchange of ideas. So, for the first time, I feel a wee bit weird about Pokémon's utopian themes. From one perspective, the perspective that the game tries to show you, teamwork and cooperation save the day. But from another perspective, you are a stranger who goes around hoovering up all the wildlife and going, actually, to the clan's traditions and beliefs. Their part in this story is to get with the program. And, yeah, they do. I mean, at least Combi is in Diamond and Pearl. I know it's Pokémon. I know that everything is solved with friendship and teamwork. The problem with this kind of cultural criticism is that it ignores basic logistics. The Diamond and Pearl clans aren't in Diamond and Pearl because they hadn't thought of them yet. Pokeballs are used so the game doesn't have to render at least 7 unique entities at all times. You already see how it's struggling. The game wasn't made to interrogate Japan's colonial past, it was made as a fresh take on Pokémon. I get it. And the game means well. It's a kid's game, you know? You want it to promote the value of cooperation. It's just that, in this specific case, to do that, it needs to be extraordinarily naive. It's the amazing soundtrack that does the heavy lifting, contributing to the idea that this is the same place at a different time. You're always catching familiar wee phrases, echoes of what's to come. As special as these sounds are, nostalgia has a pretty short half-life for me. It wears off really quickly. But this is very tasteful. The sleepy twin-leaf town becomes the first tentative steps into a new frontier. The trudging Pastoria theme is mixed into something more free and adventurous. The noble Pokémon theme combines nature and divinity by mixing the wild Pokémon theme with the lake theme. It also adds Dialga and Palkia's theme, as well as a wee touch of Arceus at the end. And, of course, I know, I've done that before, but listen to how that same theme is remixed in Snow Point Temple. Isn't that brilliant? Well, it is when it's no getting interrupted every 2 seconds. There are so many Pokémon, you're not going to get to hear many of these songs for long unless you literally stand still to listen to them. Maybe that's why I didn't recognise so many of the motifs. It took me a very long time to figure out that Cobalt Coastlands was remixing not just Route 210, but also Route 209 as well. I kinda love it, because the easy way would have been to just strum on the nostalgia strings, but this approach says far more about both settings. It's the same place, but the years have completely changed it. The audio cues are absolutely immaculate. Audio cues are super important for smoothing out some of the issues with a dynamic camera, and Legends Arceus handles it better than most. It's instantly clear when you've been spotted, when an attack is incoming, when a shiny appears, and when you've caught a Pokémon. Adding the fireworks on top of the Pokéball is an inspired touch. Imagine what it would have to do otherwise, stop every time you caught a Pokémon and then zoom in on the ball. It'd be rubbish. Just like the status conditions, weather has seen some changes too. Weather moves are out of the game completely. Instead, it's random. It just depends on if the level is sunny or foggy or snowy. It flattens yet more strategies. This is not the deepest Pokémon game, not by a long shot. But that's not what Legends Arceus is about. The weather creates more continuity between the overworld and the battles. You have to take your surroundings into account even during a fight. At its worst, it's an interruption, that kind of procedurally generated open world fluff that I'm not a fan of. It gets foggy, so you either miss every second move or you trudge back to camp and pass the time. But I still think that this was the right approach. Whether having more pronounced effects on spawn rates and maybe giving beneficial effects would probably do the trick. Beneficial effects, for example, like this. That's right, hail has gone. I guess it would be too annoying in a game that is 1/5 Arctic tundra. In its place is the new weather effect, snow, and I love it. It increases the speed of Ice-type Pokémon, it makes Frostbite more likely, and this one's my favourite, drowsy Pokémon are less likely to move. Because of the hypothermia. That's great! Not getting hypothermia, that... you get it. You don't have to have a full team of ice types anymore to make this weather worth it. It's got broadly useful effects without losing its identity. The only note that I maybe have is that I think it would make more sense if it slowed down non-ice type Pokemon rather than sped up ice types. You know, that is really splitting hairs. And practically the effect would be the exact same anyway. Let's move on. Like a lot of recent Pokemon games, there are no longer any HMs. Instead, you get Ride Pokemon. Ride Pokemon are kind of an obvious solution to this problem, and I think they're a wee bit less special because of it. Instead of your chosen Pokemon getting you around, you all working as a team, you have a collection of Pokemon for hire that do it instead. These are the same for every adventure. Every single player will have a Wordier, Ursaluna, Basculegion, Sneasler, and Braviary by the end, which kinda goes against the point of the series, at least a little bit, right? I totally get it. If there's only 5 of them, they can actually be animated. It's a compromise. That compromise is probably as ideal a solution as we are ever likely to get. Fair play to them. What really cushions the blow in this game is that your Pokemon get to be a part of this world as well. Some of the old HM moves are now universal: Headbutt, Rock Smash, even Surf, if you think about it. Now, if you're about to tell me that Headbutt was a TM and not an HM, then what I want you to do for me, just really quickly, is I want you to fold yourself up and I want you to sluice yourself down a drain. Prick. Wordier is your basic horse, you get around faster. Ursaluna is the item finder. It's far and away the one that I used the least, especially when the camera would go haywire. Maybe this contributed to my running out of crafting materials so often, but I don't know what to tell you. I want to go where I want to go. I don't want to spider all over the map randomly to get items. Oh, is that you found some mud, aye? Good job. Basculegion has a nice flow to the controls, but honestly, catching Pokemon is a bit of a nightmare. You can't sneak, and since items disappear as soon as they touch the water's surface, you have to aim in this vague area above the fish's head. Sneasler is good, but sometimes it'll get a bit confused and cling to a tree when you're just trying to pick up an item. And finally, Braviary is this game's paraglider. You may have noticed a lot of similarities between this game's moveset and Breath of the Wild. Horseback riding, climbing, and gliding are all done through Pokemon. That's not a complaint. There's a satisfying flow to moving around in this game, so it was successful. If you're going to copy anything, you might as well copy the best. Now, don't tell anybody that I said this is just between us, but I think that it perhaps even betters Breath of the Wild in some ways. Keeping climbing and gliding until late in the game ensures there's an appropriate sense of scale and progress. We haven't really talked much about the characters yet, so let's do that now. I liked them. Not too many of them are compelling, but they're all fun. The game clocks a lot of character miles by establishing their relationships and history. Akari and her Pikachu are at odds. It's weirdly nice to see that this corporate mascot still gets to be a little bastard. Adaman and Irida are never done playing up their differences. Palina and Iscan are very cute together. And the Galaxy team are a tangled knot of politics. Like I say, I'm not super attached to any of them. None of them quite make meow meow status for me, but I liked them all. I do have one note about Irida's outfit. The Pearl clan live in Alabaster, Icelands, but she goes around wearing a tube top and shorts. She plays it up, to be fair, but it still feels like the wrong choice considering how hard the rest of the game works to establish a hostile world. It kinda undermines the danger. People don't just get used to sub-zero temperatures, they develop ways to keep warm, like clothes, or getting in the kiln. Now, one thing that I don't like is that practically every major character seems to be somebody's ancestor. Kamado is Professor Rowan, Silene is Cyrus, Akari is Dawn, Aziru is Mars, Charm, Clover and Coin are Bertha, Candace and Saturn, Volo is Cynthia, and so on. There's even a picture of Maxi in the Diamond Clan huts, although he seems to be behaving more like Courtney. A couple of times it works. If you know the story of Diamond in Peril, then you're going to be second-guessing Silene the entire way through, when she's not the one you need to look out for. But having every single one be a past incarnation of a major Pokémon character robs them of the chance to have their own identity. I don't really think of Aziru as Aziru, I think of her as past Mars. A pretty distinct and likeable character, overwritten by an Easter egg hunt. It makes Sinnoh tiny and knowable. We're hundreds of years in the past, and yet not much seems to have changed. The one exception to me liking these characters was Sabi, who just kind of ended up irritating me. But that ties into some larger issues. The story is horrendously paced. There is so much fluff in the text of this game. Here's a line that stuck out to me. After the professor explains that there are lots of Pokémon in the Hisui region, Akari replies that there are in the grass, in forests, by water, or wherever they like. That's obvious, isn't it? Like, even if you are completely new to Pokémon, you're soon going to discover that just by looking at the game. This line then could be cleanly cut, and it would mean absolutely nothing. It may seem a bit weird to be picking on this one line in isolation, but a lot of the script is like this. The record keeps skipping. You're a stranger in these lands. Pokémon are dangerous. We don't know where the space-time rifts are coming from. You fell out of the sky. It's all information that you already know. Maybe it has something to do with the console. The Switch is meant to accommodate not just longer play sessions for us obsessives, but also shorter bursts in handheld mode as well. If you are playing this for half an hour on the train every morning on your way to work, then yeah, maybe you need the refresher. It might also be that they felt some of these repetitions were good characterization too. I can't tell you that they objectively have no value. Either way, mashing through some text isn't the worst offence in the world, but it is a bit agitating. No, the worst offence in the world is when the levels waste your time. After you finally make your way up to that giant tree in the Heartwood, you are instructed to go back to Jubilife and then immediately back to the giant tree.
Oh, we were right there, man!
You go from A to B and then back to A again for no real reason. After you are done with the Cobalt Coastlands, you return to Galaxy HQ to be sent home to be sent back to Galaxy HQ by Ingo. After you walk outside, you're then pulled back inside to be pushed back outside so you can go to the training grounds so the game can introduce Ingo. I want to be clear here, I haven't misspoken. Or, finally, Sabi will only give you Braviary after you cross the Alabaster Icelands, and then cross straight back across the Alabaster Icelands. It's not interesting, it's not exciting, and it sure as hell doesn't endear me to the character. Whether it's a level design issue, a writing issue, or both in tandem, this is just running up the clock. Still, I think the content of this story is, on the whole, pretty solid. The people start hard and become kinder, working together with Pokémon and each other to overcome this harsher climate. But the suspicion that has been bubbling under the entire game needs a release. When quelling all of the nobles doesn't close the space-time rift, you are exiled both from the Galaxy team and from Jubilife. It's remarkably well drawn, Kamado needing a scapegoat to pretend that he is still in control is one of the most complex ideas put across in a Pokémon game. The frustrating thing is, he's not entirely unjustified. You can't explain why you're there either. The game gets to cash in on all its character work. There is no easy answer to this problem, and the way that the characters respond to it says a lot about them. Adaman and Irida let your actions speak louder than words. Kamado is suspicious owing to his past. Silene follows his orders, while also helping as much as she can off the record. The walk through the village is kind of humiliating, mirroring your entrance with the people's suspicions finally having been confirmed. That turmoil is reflected in the sky. Pathetic fallacy. This is decent. Unfortunately, the game withdraws the threat very quickly. No sooner are you without a home base than you are given a new one, the Ancient Retreat, the settlement that presumably becomes Celestic Town. Mechanically, your exile only really amounts to a couple of shops being shut. Kogita is the game's second Cynthia analogue. I don't think we know if her and Volo are related, but they certainly seem to know each other. Now, I draw attention to her because I really didn't like her outfit at first. I didn't get why this ancient spiritual ancestress was dressing in fairly modern, elegant European clothes. But the more I think about it, the more sense it makes for her to be displaced in space and time. She is the closest person here to having all of the answers that go beyond Dialga and Palkia. Speaking of whom, to quell whichever almighty Sinnoh lies beyond the rift, we'll have to craft the Red Chain. Now, I was always under the impression that the Red Chain was a Cyrus invention. He tortures the Lake Trio to shackle Dialga to his will. I always thought the theming was that he thought he couldn't bring out Dialga's true power using a Pokeball, when you can go and disprove that. It's kind of interesting how a storyteller revisiting an old setting can expose these kinds of misunderstandings. Another example is that I was always under the impression that Eterna was much older than Jubilife. If you had asked me which would be the home base in this game, I would have guessed Eterna. But that is never actually stated. I had always just kind of assumed that on my own. All the same, it does feel a wee bit weird being encouraged to craft a red chain yourself. I love how you actually do it though. Mesprit, Yuxie and Azelf's challenges embody emotion, knowledge and willpower, respectively. Mesprit has no wrong answer, speaking to the subjective nature of emotion. Yuxie tests your knowledge on Pokémon facts, and Azelf tests your willpower by just trying to make you second guess yourself. Your rewards are all hen's teeth. Mesprit has no plumes, Yuxie no claws, and Azelf no fangs. The absurdity is kind of the point, I think, that whole Buddhist paradox, what is the sound of one hand clapping? This is the kind of work that makes legendary Pokémon feel legendary. Kamado is already at the peak of Mount Coronet, inviting disaster by challenging whatever's on the other side. Benny challenges you on your way up, revealing that he is, in fact, a ninja. Okay? Like if the lassie behind the counter at Subway went, "Surprise, I'm a ninja," I'd be like that. Like, I wasn't expecting that, but can I get that on herbs and cheese bread, please? Trainer battles in this game are scarce, and take two forms. Multi-battles, where the opponent sends out a bunch of Pokémon at once, and their traditional form. Of course, the turn order introduces some complications. Action speed is inherited between switches, meaning that if you score a KO, more often than not the incoming Pokémon will move first. It's almost like the opposite of the switch style. The trainer that has just lost a Pokémon gets priority. It makes a lot more sense that way. With the rest of the stat and battle changes, fights become fast-paced slugfests, you both rapidly trading Pokémon. Again, I couldn't possibly dissect all of these strategic implications, but it's exciting. Earlier in your exile, you got to choose whether to go with Adaman or Irida at one point. This decision decides the final boss. Go with Irida and you fight Palkia and then Origin Dialga. If you're like me and went with Adaman, it's the other way around. I don't think it makes much difference, you get both of them anyway. Dialga and Palkia's new Origin forms take a lot from Arceus, suggesting that these are more pure, more divine. They both look goofy as anything, but in the same way as Arceus, there's a sense of unknowable logic to them that makes them fun to examine. Dodge some laser beams and pelt some snacks at God's head, and you can successfully catch them. The day is saved, you're welcomed back into the Galaxy team with open arms, roll credits. I was trying to think of something to say about this, but it's only so unremarkable because it's so solid. Earlier games had that weird pacing issue where the narrative climax and the mechanical climax were two separate things. That Legends Arceus manages to focus all three of its climaxes is an accomplishment for this series. I know how I'm supposed to feel about this. Now, it seems like it's about time for that traditional shoogles post-game rant. You know the one. The one where I complain about how bloody tedious and confusing it is to sort out all the EVs and IVs and the abilities and the nature and to organise the breeding and the move tutors and the TMs so that you can take on the game's toughest challenges. Except, there's a wee twist this time. Because they've only gone and bloody done it, haven't they? They've fixed it. Like, okay, this isn't like a wee step in the right direction. I don't have mixed feelings about this. They've just knocked it out the park as far as I'm concerned. Pokemon can now learn every single move in their arsenal all at once. You just have to have 4 equipped at a time. That's genius. That completely eliminates the busy work from TMs and move management. Okay, so how do you learn these moves? Well, besides leveling up, every single one can be learned from Zissou, the Security Corps captain. No fiddling about, no cross-referencing guides, no traipsing all the way across the map. If you want to learn a move, you know exactly where to go. Right, so what about evolution? How does that affect your moves? Well, for the most part, it doesn't. Filling in the dex entries is a much better reason not to evolve your Pokémon than contrived moveset limitations. So, evolution now only happens when the conditions are met, and then when you specifically select it from the menu. There are plenty of clues about how to evolve your Pokémon in the Pokédex, and if you need an item to evolve, most can be bought in Jubilife. There's even an item here that works on trade evolutions. You can still trade if you want, but it's no longer mandatory. Every single Pokémon is available here. You even get the other 2 starters after you finish the game. And I can confirm that it doesn't affect the game negatively at all. You get the choice of how you want to complete the task. Nicknames can be changed at any time, straight from the menu. There's no need to have the name rater to officiate. I finally got my water-type team member, Oshawott. Using this excellent feature, I named him Washalot. If your Pokémon has a bad nature, it's very easy to farm for mints. Literally, you just ask the farm in Jubilife to grow mints a few times and you'll have them in bulk. And lastly, and this is the big one, this is the one that I am really excited for, EVs and IVs have been combined into the grit system. It's basically the Titanite system from that certain other influential action RPG series. I mean, right? There are 4 tiers of grit, each one allowing you to take a Pokemon's effort level slightly higher to a maximum of 10 in each stat. It's transparent, easy to understand, and it lets you train and customize your Pokemon as you go. You get grit by releasing the Pokemon that you catch. So you can invest in this system, right? Just by playing the game, rather than it being this weird, dedicated, esoteric grind after the game is already over. It also means that a freshly caught Pokemon can be as strong as your mainstays, and if it's not, you know exactly why. And because the game knows you can understand this system, it means that it can be more challenging as well. It's perfect. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Years of mealy-mouthed ranting, mainly from me, to be fair, and the solution is so simple and it's so sensible. My one note is, if this system were going to come across to the main series, and let me be clear, I think it should, there probably should be some kind of cap. The great thing about EVs was that you had to customize your Pokemon. You couldn't max out every single stat, so you had to prioritize different stats depending on your strategy. But as for this game, just in a vacuum, yeah, it works brilliantly. What all of this means, in totality, in sum, is that I am willing to experiment with my team. Wrong nature? No problem. Bad stats? We can fix those. Low level? It's easy for them to catch up. You'll notice that I've not mentioned breeding, and that's because it's gone. There's no need for it. All of its benefits are covered here in a much simpler, quicker, more satisfying way. It's all killer, no filler. I'm not grinding for hours and hours trying to catch or breed the perfect Clefable. I just spotted a Clefable, I went, hell yes, and I caught it. I named her Pavlova. I am making tangible, interesting decisions the whole way through rather than abstract ones. I am seeing the fantasy rather than the mechanics. So, Legends Arceus then frames a lot of the series' problems as arbitrary rather than endemic. There's no need for these systems to be as obtuse as they are. There never was. I think what I'm really saying here is that I cannot go back to EVs and IVs, man. This is exactly what you're wanting. Sinnoh, or Hisui, is known for having millions of legendaries. Probably the most divisive one in this game is Manaphy because of its quest, the Sea's Legend. The quest is named after a book, which gives you the clues to open Manaphy's chamber in the Cobalt Coastlands. The problem, as Iskin describes it, nobody knows much about either the book or the legend. And it's left at that. Now, I'm going to spoil it here, right? The solution isn't in this game at all. The Sea's Legend can only be found in Canalave Library in Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. You can see why that's divisive, right? Like, I completely get being frustrated if you scoured this game for the answer. But honestly, I kinda love it. Where else would you find books but a library? And where is the library in Hisui? Well, there's one in the future, but you can't access that. Except, of course, you can. It's just about believing that the game would be bold enough to bridge this gap itself. Your character is supposed to be from the present day as well. It kinda works, at least in my head. Like I say, I totally get why this wouldn't work for someone, but let's consider the alternative. They could have simply locked Manaphy behind owning Brilliant Diamond or Shining Pearl. It's boring, it's cynical, it lacks community, it lacks puzzle solving. This way, even if you don't own Brilliant Diamond or Shining Pearl yourself, you can still complete the Sea's Legend and get Manaphy either by looking it up or by asking somebody. We don't even have to imagine how bad the alternative would be. If you don't own Brilliant Diamond or Shining Pearl, you can't get Darkrai, full stop. If you don't own Sword or Shield, you can't get Shaman. Now, they don't contribute to the Pokédex, thankfully, but, that's still a lot worse, isn't it? I will take a cheeky wee esoteric quest any day of the week over this. I would also take a cheeky wee esoteric quest over just following an objective marker. I tore through the rest of the legendaries because the game just tells you where to go. Regirock, Regice and Registeel aren't even in this game, so you just have to gather the stone, icicle and iron plates from unrelated side quests. Afterwards, you are just pointed at Regigigas. Oh my god, Game Freak, will you just give this poor man a break? Finally, we have Unknown and Spiritomb. Now these are both like two sides of the same coin. They're both game-spanning quests, but one is well executed, and the other, not so much. The Unknown quest is the good one. 28 of them are scattered around the game, with them spelling out clues to their location in the Unknown decks. It's a game-long scavenger hunt, with really strong results. The hints are just oblique enough to get you thinking, while also narrowing down the possibilities. The unknown can't just be anywhere, you always have a pretty good idea of where to look. It was a joy finding one. It was always satisfying, like solving a wee puzzle. Spiritomb, unfortunately, is a lot sloppier. It takes the form of 107 wisps scattered around the overworld. There are no clues to these ones. They show up more clearly at night, and you do get a wee tally of how many are left in each area, but otherwise, you're on your own. It means scouring an area, flying around aimlessly without any sense of direction. I was resigned when I was collecting these. I was thinking to myself, one more down. I don't know why Spiritomb is so difficult to get in these games. I mean, it's not that good. I kinda like it though. It's definitely more interesting this way, so, keep it up. Which leads us, finally, into the second endgame. Volo. Have I mentioned Volo? He's like this merchant that is obsessed with ruins that has been following you around. Anyway, it turns out that Volo used Giratina to rip open the space-time rifts, hoping to meet Arceus. In short, he is responsible for all of the events of the game. If that is all coming out of nowhere, yeah, it feels that way to me too. He obviously had an agenda, but I want to overthrow God and recreate the universe is a wee bit out of nowhere, He doesn't leave much of an impact, even when he reveals his true form.
Yes, oh great and mighty Grand Champion!
What Volo lacks as a villain, though, he more than makes up for in the fight. He's a lot like Cynthia in that way. I mean, the sense of showmanship here is great. From his title as Pokémon Wielder Volo, to the slugfest that is the trainer battles in this game, to the gut drop when Giratina appears, to the other gut drop when Giratina transforms, It's a real challenge, and it's a worthy send-off for the game. If you are going all the way, though, the game firmly settles into its final loop. You are no longer defeating bosses to unlock new areas, you are instead going back and forth between the 5 levels to complete the Pokédex. Now, one of my favourite things about this game was the fantasy. There are now fewer barriers than ever between you and that idea of catching Pokémon that we all fell in love with. Outbreaks are the point where that fantasy begins to break down. You can catch dozens of Pokémon while they spawn out of thin air. It is great, essential even, for finishing off your research tasks. In fact, I suspect that that is the entire reason it's here. But it's difficult to get invested in the same way. It kinda cheapens the Pokémon. No more sneaking up on them, no more learning their behaviour, no more stalking, none of the thrill of the chase and the catch. You just wade in hip deep in Pokémon and you start throwing around sticky globs and then Ultra Balls. There are also the massive mass outbreaks, which are, for the purposes of this discussion at least, essentially the same thing. I only really bring them up to soothe the pedants, and also to talk about the really overlong sequence of quests that introduces them 5 times, once for each map. By the way, if you don't hit your goal of 3 outbreaks, for, whatever reason, then you can't actually continue this quest until more spawn. This happened to me and I genuinely started to worry that I'd maybe soft-locked the game, but no, if this happens to you, just keep travelling back and forth to Jubilife. You'll get there eventually. This is also the point where some of the shortcomings become apparent. There are so many Pokémon on screen and you are dodging and throwing so quickly that it's easier to notice the cracks. The first big problem I had was that, intermittently, the controls felt stickier. Your character will sometimes dodge in the direction that they're facing, not the direction that you're holding. I think that this is tied to the frame rate or something. It was especially pronounced during the Avalugg fight, its massive size kind of tanking the performance. The other big problem is that if you stun a Pokémon while it's charging an attack, the attack will still go off, but only if it's ranged. If it's physical, it won't. If it tries to tackle you, it'll just cancel the attack. It means that you are effectively removing ranged Pokémon's tell. The telegraphing that is saying, I'm about to use an attack, stops working. These controls are really good, but if they're going to carry the game now, then they need to be immaculate. And they're not quite there. It occurs to me that I haven't mentioned the space-time distortions yet. Space-time distortions, or STDs, nope, let's call them space-time distortions, are special areas that are more likely to spawn the more time you spend in a level without resting or leaving. I think it climbs to 100% at like 40 minutes or so. The game needs to have these to be able to include Pokémon like Shieldon and Porygon, Pokémon essential to the full Sinnoh experience, or so I think, but don't quite fit the setting. Shieldon is a prehistoric Pokémon and Porygon is an artificial Pokémon made with computers. Some sort of digital monster, if you will. I like these things alright, that they're a decent change of pace. The problem is, towards the end, right, if you are missing a dex entry or two, I would lay a penny to a pound that it's from a distortion. So if you want to fill in that last wee bit, you have to hang around doing nothing for up to 40 minutes. Now, to be fair, it's usually not going to take that long, but sometimes it will. I don't think there's an easy solution to this. If the distortions were faster, if they were guaranteed, then they wouldn't feel that special anymore. I think they would lose something. But all the same, yeah, sometimes you have to stand around doing nothing for a while. That's not ideal. There is also a bit of a problem with Magnemite. It can only be found in space-time distortions in the Cobalt Coastlands, but because Magnezone can be found in the Coronet Highlands, the entire evolutionary line is filed under the Coronet dex. So if you are looking for Magnemite, your first thought is, it's going to be in Coronet. It's not. That is going to cause somebody some problems. That's somebody having two thumbs. With how hectic things get, you're going to take some lumps. Like I said all the way back at the start, Pokémon can attack the player now. Get hit too many times too quickly and you'll be knocked out. You lose some items from your satchel and you respawn back at camp. If you're online, you can reclaim lost satchels and send them back to other players for a small reward. Dying, then, is basically just losing a few items for a while. It's the right balance for Pokémon, I feel, a slap in the wrist, but without any lasting consequences. Legends Arceus is now on a clock. Sometime in the future the servers will be taken down, and at that point this experience will be irrevocably changed. You aren't going to be able to recover those items at all. Every blackout will come with permanent consequences. The game will get marginally more difficult. If that seems like an unbelievably minor hypothetical complaint, yeah, sure, it is. The reason that I bring it up though is so that I can praise the game for having the foresight to generate satchels even if the player is offline. That way you can still get your merit points to buy evolution items. Players aren't going to have to worry about weird back-end workarounds a few years down the line. You're going to get something very close to the full experience. And speaking of workarounds, the game has a few bugs that you can exploit. Or I can exploit. I did exploit. The first is to do with massive mass outbreaks. Ordinarily, you have to give Mai's Munchlax 5 Aguav berries to see which Pokémon have spawned. But the Switch has a built-in screenshot system, so you can just save, screenshot, and restart. This is one of those exploits, like time travel in the older games, that is so obvious that you have to assume they knew about it. That they left it in speaks to how little this actually matters, I suppose. I ended up just giving Munchlax the berries. It was a lot faster. More contentious and less obvious is the infinite money glitch. Ahahaha, now you're listening. So, I found that the balance was kinda falling apart at the end. I wasn't making enough money and I wasn't gathering enough materials to get all the stuff I needed. I resorted to an extremely repetitive money grinding loop of travelling to the Obsidian Fieldlands, going in a big circle so I could find the misfortunes, and then when they didn't spawn I would just return to Jubilife and then do it again. It was soul sucking. But there is an alternative. What you do is this. Go to Ingo, release a single Pokémon, and then separately release a Pokémon between level 10 and 25. Afterwards, release a mass amount of Pokémon. These don't have to be anything specific, but the more grit you get for them, the better. Back out to Ingo and he'll give you your grit. Then, you can go back in and start releasing Pokémon one by one, backing out each time to repeat the same massive grit payout. Basically, you get the reward for all of these Pokémon for every single one of these. You can go ahead and keep the grit if you want to strengthen your Pokémon, or you can sell it for massive amounts of cash. Now, I struggled a lot with whether or not to use this glitch in this video. It's clearly not intentional, and I wanted to cover the game as designed, not modded or altered in any way. What made my mind up was two things. One, it is functionally the same as me grinding the misfortunes, just minus hours of footage on my hard drive and out of my life. Two, it gives me the opportunity to talk about how this often happens, because this feels kind of like an inevitability in these kinds of open world style games, the point where you're seeking exploits or cheesy strategies, because doing it properly is just so boring. Think of like the Soul Gem glitch in Oblivion, the series of duplication glitches in Breath of the Wild, or killing that giant crow in Elden Ring. Players are so determined to skip the grind that it becomes like an arms race between them and the patches. Is that a problem? Well, I don't really know, because to be honest with you, it is kind of fun to get one over on the game like this. But if I assume that the game doesn't want me to do this, then I think it needs to look inwards first. I wouldn't have even been tempted had the input and reward been balanced better. Like, I get it, right? The game has effectively ended. I am being particularly meticulous because I'm doing a video. The game has offered me ample stopping points, and I'm not taking them. But this is kind of the problem, right? With the modern idea of the big budget video game having infinite content. They just keep going. They can't end on a high note. Once they exhaust their own enthusiasm, it's only a matter of time before the player gets exhausted as well. Eventually, they just won't pick it up again, and that's their ending. Not a bang, but a whimper. So the question becomes, why haven't I stopped then? Well, it's because, for the first time in my 2 decades with the series, I did this. I think it's a combination of things. The fact that you don't have to trade to get everything, the hints towards completion in the decks, but mainly, I think it was just making catching Pokémon such a focus, It felt like the point of this game, not defeating the League or a villainous team. Sure, there is a narrative and a conflict, but it felt like it was framing the idea of catching them all, not distracting from it. Honestly, after having spent so long with this series, literally the majority of my life with Pokémon as a familiar face, and with that wonderful Jubilife remix in the background, I don't mind telling you, right? It kinda hit me weird. That's all I'm saying. I'm not admitting to crying at a Pokémon game. Get a grip. Your reward? An audience with Arceus itself. Arceus has a wonderful design, does it not? There's something so divine and mysterious about it. The fight's a good one too. I particularly like how it telegraphs its charge move by calling back to Shadow Force. That's a really clever bit of design. After you beat it, you get to carry a piece of it around with you, which is the game's explanation for how you're able to put God in your pocket. It's another untidy retcon, like the shrinking Pokémon, but again, it serves the game's purposes, so I'm not about to get all up in arms about it. I even went so far as to get research level 10 on all Pokémon so that I could get the shiny charm. Which makes a lot of sense, honestly. Once you are done with the decks, what else is there to do but shiny hunt? I fear I may have gone too far with this one. I thought that I would have something to say about this. Isn't it kinda weird that the RNG is static, so if you fail to catch a shiny, you can just reload a checkpoint? Yeah, that's all I've got left. Let's wrap this up. In a lot of ways, Legends Arceus is the Pokémon game that I've been waiting for, even if it's not exactly how I imagined it. It's not quite the ultimate Pokémon game, but that's only because that doesn't actually mean anything. Instead, what we have here is a game that sees itself through on its own terms. The mechanics have evolved and changed at their core, thought through to deliver a complete experience all its own. It's not a new gimmick layered on top of decades-old mechanics, and it's not an old game reheated. It's fresh. Even with its issues, I found it so much more satisfying than any Pokémon game in recent memory. I would take another game like this over Pitch Black and Pure White any day of the week. Now, I worry what people take from that is that I want Pokémon Legends Unova over a remake, but that's not my point. I don't want Pokémon Legends to establish a new sub-series with its own set of rigid rules. I don't want the main series and the Legends series to be completely separated, and ne'er the two shall meet. No, I want to take this game's adventurous spirit to heart, not its formula. I want to see fresh takes on old ideas. Sure, they might fail. Arceus only knows that this game did a lot. But they might also succeed. And in that case, we should get to have our cake and eat it. This isn't an either-or situation. To wit, this game presents an incredible alternative to the EV-IV system. With a little bit of iteration, I would love to see it adopted by the rest of the series. That genie is firmly out the bottle now, I'm afraid. We now know that this series can change. Unfortunately though, change is kind of erratic in this series. This game launched on the 28th of January 2022. Generation 9 was announced on the 27th of February, less than a month later. So a lot of people just didn't bother. They skipped Legends Arceus to wait for Scarlet and Violet instead. Now, I can't be too mad, Legends Arceus sold more than any other game could reasonably hope for. But all the same, it was a little bit frustrating to see a game that I really liked get muscled out the way by a game that I think turned out much worse. I can't blame Game Freak for this, of course. It's just the nature of the beast. Both games were developed in parallel. Legends Arceus actually started development before even Sword and Shield. There was no way that they could take on feedback between teams and projects, and I think that that contributes massively to the audience's fatigue. Games come out so rapidly and quality is so sporadic that it's a bit difficult to stay invested in the series as a whole. I mean, never mind Game Freak, I need a break from this schedule. It's why I'm glad that they seem to be taking their time with Pokémon Legends ZA. Here's hoping. I loved this one.